A bone-chilling wind off the English Channel, a damp fog enveloping the hills, and the cold ground beneath my feet. Medieval England. We imagine knights and castles, but what about those who lived on this land every day? A peasant or shepherd caught in bad weather far from the village, or an entire community faced with a parched well during a rare but devastating drought. Where could they get a sip of clean water? In a world without running water, bottled water, and maps of sources, every drop was worth its weight in gold. Water was life, but it could also be death if it came from a contaminated stream or stagnant pond. Survival depended not on strength, but on knowledge. Quiet, almost instinctive, passed down from generation to generation. Knowledge of how to read animal tracks, how to listen to the trees, and how to make the earth itself give up its hidden moisture. The Middle Ages is not only an era of great buildings, but also a time of ingenious in its simplicity household tricks. People learned to extract water where it seemed to be absent, using only what nature gave them and their own observation. These methods are all but forgotten today, supplanted by technology, but they still work. And here's the question. If one day we are left alone with nature, deprived of our usual comforts, will we be able to remember the wisdom of our ancestors? Will we be able to quench our thirst by relying only on our eyes, hands, and minds, as an unnamed English peasant did 1,000 years ago? Stay tuned to learn 10 forgotten but effective ways of extracting water that helped us survive in medieval England. When all known springs dried up and the sky remained cloudless for weeks, the medieval peasant or hunter turned to the most reliable guides he could find: wild animals. He knew the immutable law of nature. All living things need water, and animals instinctively know where to find it, even if it is hidden from human eyes. An experienced tracker went out at dawn and searched not for water, but for trails. Many tracks, deer, wild boar, foxes, converging at one point in the lowlands were a sure sign that somewhere up ahead there was a spring, a stream, or an inconspicuous lake. The animals would not wander senselessly. Their routes always lay between pastures, rookeries, and watering places. Tracks of herbivores such as deer or roe deer were particularly valuable, as they need regular drinking and their trails almost certainly led to water. Bird behavior was also an important clue. Flocks of small birds circling over a particular spot at dawn or dusk often indicated the presence of a spring. The peasant knew that where birds sang and drank, man could quench his thirst. Not only birds, but also insects served as guides. For example, a bee trail, when bees flew low and straight, almost always led to a stream or pond. And the croaking of frogs at dusk was the most reliable musical accompaniment, indicating the presence of a swampy lowland where one could dig a hole and wait for it to fill with moisture. It was a search that involved all the senses. An experienced man not only looked under his feet, but also listened to the silence of the forest, trying to catch the murmur of a hidden stream or the buzzing of the midges that always hovered over the water. He inhaled the air, trying to smell the characteristic odor of damp earth and fresh leaves, which was always stronger at the source. It was not a hunt, but rather a meditation, a total immersion in the rhythms of nature, where every sound and smell could be the key to salvation. This method required not only keen eyesight, but also patience. Sometimes it was necessary to follow the trail for hours, keeping quiet so as not to scare the animals and not to lose sight of them. At the same time, such a pursuit for water was fraught with risk. The animal trail could lead into a deep thicket, into the territory of a wolf or wild boar, or into an impassable swamp. Medieval English ballads and stories often mention hunters who, in pursuit of deer, came to enchanted springs hidden deep in the forest. Behind these legends was a very real practical experience. In monastic chronicles describing the development of new lands, monks often noted that the first settlements in skeets were founded in places indicated by wild beasts. This was the surest way to find a stable source of clean water in an unfamiliar area. This method, based on pure observation, is still one of the key methods in the art of wilderness survival today. In the chalk hills of southern England, especially in Sussex and Wiltshire, you can find amazing structures, dew ponds. These are small, artificially created ponds located on the very tops of hills, which, contrary to all logic, rarely dry up even in dry summers. although they have no visible sources of nutrition, neither streams nor springs. To medieval man, they seemed a true miracle. The secret of these ponds was an ingenious design. The peasants dug a shallow bowl, the bottom of which was carefully insulated. First, a layer of clay was laid to prevent water from seeping into the porous, chalky soil. This clay was often puddinged, thoroughly trampled with human feet or animal hooves to make it as dense and watertight as possible. A layer of straw was often placed on top of the clay to act as an insulator, preventing the heat of the earth from heating the water during the day. Sometimes a layer of soot was added, which was thought to help the pond cool down faster at night by increasing condensation. The very location of the pond on top of the hill was part of this ingenious stratagem. Contrary to intuition, it was here, in an open space to all winds, that the ideal conditions were created. The wind during the day increased evaporative cooling of the surface, and at night, when the sky was clear, the hilltop cooled faster than the lowlands and was more often enveloped in a damp fog from which the precious moisture was squeezed out. The principle of operation was simple. During the day, the water in the pond remained relatively cold due to insulation. At night, when the air temperature dropped sharply, moisture from the air condensed on the cold surface of the water and the adjacent grass flowing into the pond. This was especially effective in foggy and humid weather. Thus, the pond was constantly replenished by dew and fog. For medieval shepherds who herded their flocks on the waterless chalk hills, such ponds were vital. They provided a watering place for sheep where the nearest river was many kilometers away. Many of these ponds were created hundreds, if not thousands, of years ago, and their location and design have been passed down from generation to generation. Moreover, the sheep not only drank from the pond, but also cared for it unwittingly. With their hooves, they constantly compacted the clay bottom, preventing it from cracking and preventing leaks. It was a perfect example of a self-sustaining system. Legends and superstitions often arose around dew ponds. They were considered to be places of power, associated with druids or fairies. The fact that many dew ponds were located near ancient megalithic structures or burial mounds also contributed to their mystical aura. Imagine a lonely pond on a hilltop at dawn, shrouded in mist. It was easy to believe that it was filled not by the laws of physics, but by the will of the ancient gods. But behind this magic was a precise calculation and a deep understanding of the laws of physics. It was a trick that allowed collecting water directly from the air. Today, scientists continue to study these amazing structures, and some enthusiasts even restore them, proving that ancient technologies work even today. In summer, during a drought, many small rivers and streams in England could dry up completely at the surface, leaving behind only a ribbon of dry gravel and sand. To the inexperienced traveler, this meant no water, but the medieval peasant knew that the river was not dead. It had simply gone underground, and it could be reached. He found the lowest spot in the channel, usually at a bend in the river, where the current was slower and the water washed out the deeper hole. He knew instinctively that it was at the outer bend of the channel, where the water had been washing out the deepest part for centuries. And it was there, under the gravel layer, that the subsoil moisture was retained longest. At this spot, stepping back a little from the supposed center of the former stream, he would start digging. His tools were simple: a wooden shovel, his own hands, or even a sharp stone. He knew he didn't have to dig deep. Often it was enough to dig half a meter or a meter deep to reach the wet sand. And then a small miracle would happen. Water would slowly seep into the hole he had dug. At first it was murky, but gradually, as the surrounding sand and gravel filtered it, the water in the hole became clear and cold. Then the test of patience began. One had to wait, sometimes for a long time, watching the wet sand at the bottom of the hole gradually darken and turn into a puddle of muddy sludge. The peasant was in no hurry. He knew that the first rush of water would carry away the mud and sludge. Only after a while, when the water pressure had stabilized and it had undergone repeated filtration, would the very salvific, cold and clear water collect in the hole. This process was akin to meditation, a dialogue with the earth, which reluctantly gave up its secrets. This method was particularly valuable because the water filtered through the river sediment was much cleaner and safer than water from a stagnant puddle. It was a natural filter created by the river itself. Sometimes, to improve water quality and strengthen the walls of the pit, it was lined inside with large pebbles, creating a kind of stone reservoir that prevented the sand from collapsing and allowed the water to settle further. The peasant had only to help nature a little by digging this primitive but effective well. Such river wells were temporary. After a heavy rain, they could be covered with sand and had to be dug again. But the knowledge that there was life beneath a dry riverbed was invaluable. In times of great drought, when even the village well dried up, the whole community could go to the river, and the dry riverbed would be covered with dozens of these small wells, each with a family working at it. It became an act of collective survival, making it possible to find water on hikes and to provide water for livestock when pastures burned out. This stratagem, based on a simple understanding of hydrology, is still one of the basic rules of survival in drylands today. At the end of a long and grueling winter, when supplies were running low and the first green was still a long way off, nature gave the English peasant an amazing gift: birch sap. In the period from late February to April, before the leaves blossom on the trees, birch trees begin to actively pump sweet, refreshing sap down their trunks. It was not a miracle, but an awakening of nature. The starch accumulated over the summer in the roots was being converted into sugar, and root pressure was rushing this nutritious liquid upward with great force to nourish future buds. And people learned to extract it by intercepting a small part of this flow of life. This method was particularly common in the northern and wooded areas of England. The shepherd or woodcutter would choose a healthy, mature birch tree on a sunny slope, knowing that it would wake up early. He made a small, shallow cut on the trunk or drilled a hole with a simple drill. A clear liquid slowly began to ooze out of the wound, drop by drop. A birch bark bowl, a clay pot, or simply a large leaf rolled up in a funnel was placed under the incision, and the sap flowed into the container. In a day, several liters of precious moisture could be collected from one tree. This sap was not just water. It contained sugars, vitamins, and microelements, which were so necessary for an organism weakened during the winter. The flavor of this drink was unique, pure like melted water, with a subtle woody note and a light natural sweetness that had nothing to do with the sweetness of honey or sugar. But it was appreciated not only for its flavor. Birch sap was considered a powerful spring tonic, a living water that cleanses the blood, removes toxins accumulated over the winter, and restores strength. It was given to children, the elderly, and the sick for a speedy recovery. Birch sap was drunk fresh. It was an excellent thirst quencher. It could be used to cook porridge or chowder, which gave them a slight sweetness. Sometimes it was left to ferment, producing a low-alcohol, fizzy drink, a kind of birch beer. This low-alcohol drink was an important part of spring festivals such as May Day, symbolizing the farewell to winter and celebrating the rebirth of nature. It was a real elixir of life, which nature gave completely free of charge. The trees were treated with great care. The peasant never destroyed the tree by cutting too deep or taking all the sap. After picking, the wound was often covered with clay or moss so that it would heal faster. This was a sign of respect for the forest as a breadwinner. The knowledge of weeping birches was part of the forest wisdom that allowed water and food to be obtained where there seemed to be only bare trees. But what to do if the sap movement season is still far away and the water in a puddle is obviously unfit for drinking? And in this case, medieval man had his own answer. Often the problem was not finding water, but finding water suitable for drinking. Water in puddles, stagnant ponds, or slow streams was often murky, foul-smelling, and full of dangerous microorganisms. Boiling was a reliable method of disinfection, but required fire and time. Therefore, medieval people used the ingenious in its simplicity method of natural filtration. If a peasant found only a muddy spring, he did not drink directly from it. Instead, he would dig a small hole in the ground, half a meter or a meter away from the edge of the body of water. He would wait for this hole to fill with water, which seeped through a layer of sand, gravel, and soil. This layer of earth worked like a natural filter. Sand, clay, and plant roots trapped large particles of mud, silt, and leaves. The water coming into the dug hole was much cleaner and clearer than in the main source. Of course, such a filter could not remove all bacteria, but it significantly improved the quality of water, making it safer and more palatable. The peasant did not know about germs, but he trusted centuries of experience. Water that had passed through the ground was less likely to cause stomach ailments. This was knowledge paid for by the health and lives of many generations of his ancestors. Sometimes more complicated filters were created for better purification. A wicker basket or coarse cloth bag was filled with layers of clean sand, crushed charcoal from a fire, and fine gravel. Sometimes moss or dense woolen cloth was used as the first layer to trap the largest particles. The genius of this method was also in the fact that over time, after the passage of water through it, on the top layer of sand formed a thin biological layer, a film of microorganisms, which paradoxically made the filter even more effective, detaining even invisible to the eye threats. An experienced person knew that an old filter often worked better than a new one. The turbid water was then slowly passed through this homemade filter. The charcoal was excellent at absorbing unpleasant odors and some harmful substances. This method required more effort but yielded almost pure water. The process itself was a kind of alchemy. Watching the thick, brown sludge scooped from the forest puddle slowly seep through the layers and emerge from the bottom in clear, cool drops was a miracle. The swampy odor was gone. The murk was gone. The water lost its unpleasant taste and became just water, the most precious treasure for a tired traveler. This first sip of clean, cool water was not just a quenching of thirst, but a real relief and victory over the hostile environment. Such knowledge was vital, especially on a hike or during fieldwork when questionable sources had to be used. Knowing how to purify water was as important a survival skill as knowing how to build a fire or shelter. It avoided dysentery and other intestinal infections that were the scourge of the Middle Ages. But sometimes nature itself created the perfect reservoirs of clean water. You just had to know where to find them. Old mighty trees, such as oaks, beeches, or ash trees, were not just a source of wood for the medieval Englishman, but also potential stores of water. Their trunks would often develop hollows and deep cavities over time, where rainwater would accumulate. This forest hiding place could save the life of a lost traveler or hunter. The water in the hollow trees, especially those located high above the ground, was surprisingly clean. It was protected from contamination by animals, and no dirt from the ground got into it. Sure, it had a dark brownish tint and a peculiar flavor from the tree bark and dead leaves, but it was safe to drink. The wood and tannins in it even had some antiseptic properties. Of course, this water was not sterile. A whole microcosm could exist in it. Mosquito larvae, small aquatic insects, particles of moss. But for medieval man, this was not always a bad sign. On the contrary, the presence of life in water often meant that it was not poisoned, unlike suspiciously dead water in a stagnant puddle. Checking water quality was a whole ritual based on the senses. First, there was the smell. Water should not smell of rot or swamp. A slight woody or earthy aroma was considered a good sign. Next, the sight. It was filtered through a piece of cloth to assess the amount of debris and small inhabitants. Water that looked clear, even if dark in color, was highly valued. It was only then that one took a careful, small sip to make sure there was no bitterness or other unpleasant taste. Finding such a water tree was a great fortune. Experienced foresters and hunters knew the location of such trees in their lands and kept them secret as a valuable resource. Knowledge of such wells was part of the unspoken heritage of a family or clan, a kind of secret survival map passed down from father to son. The peasant memorized such trees during summer rounds of the forest to know exactly where to go when in need. Sometimes to get water from a deep hollow, a long hollow reed or a piece of cloth was used, which was lowered into the hollow, let it soak up moisture, and then squeezed out. Folklore and legends often mention magical trees that fed heroes with living water. Behind these fairy tale images, there was most likely a very real practice of using hollows as springs. Water from such a hollow found in the forest could indeed seem like a miracle. This method required observation and knowledge of the forest. You had to be able to recognize old trees that could store water and check the quality of the water. But for a man who lived in harmony with the forest, this was a natural part of his survival skills. Besides trees, another ingenious tool for collecting moisture from the air was wool. Wet, foggy conditions are a hallmark of many parts of England, especially the coasts and uplands. And medieval shepherds and farmers learned to make the best of even this seemingly unpleasant weather. They invented a method of fog catching, Using the most accessible and effective material, sheep's wool. Sheep's wool, especially unwashed wool with preserved lanolin, has the unique ability to attract and hold tiny droplets of water from the mist on its many fibers. Each wool fiber, with its scaly structure, worked like a microscopic condenser, providing a huge surface area for moisture to settle. It was a natural nanotechnological material created for the survival of sheep in damp climates and ingeniously adapted by man for his needs. A shepherd could simply hang a piece of sheepskin or a skein of wool on a tree branch or fence overnight. By morning, the wool was heavy and wet from condensed moisture. All that was left was to squeeze it thoroughly into an earthen bowl. The amount of water collected depended on the density of the fog and the size of the piece of wool, but overnight one could collect up to a liter of the purest fresh water. It was water distilled by nature itself, requiring no additional purification. The location of the trap was crucial. An experienced farmer or shepherd never set a trap in a low place. The best places were on the crests of hills or on open promontories facing the sea, where the moist wind blew with the greatest force. He knew that the fog was essentially a cloud that had descended to the ground, and it was necessary to set his net right in its path. This knowledge of the topography and local winds was the key to success. Sometimes entire fog traps were created to increase efficiency. Several rows of coarse woolen yarn or a net woven from it were stretched between two poles. A container was placed under the structure to collect water. The wind drove the fog through this net, and drops of moisture settled on the fibers, gradually flowing downward. The collection process itself was almost meditative. In the silence of the night, broken only by the whispering of the wind, one could hear the drops slowly gathering and drifting downward. Not surprisingly, the folklore of coastal counties such as Cornwall and Devon preserved legends of air wells and mist nets, woven by sea spirits or fairies. It was easy for a man who got the purest water from literally nothing to believe in a miracle. This method was ingenious in its simplicity and was ideally suited to the English climate. It required no effort other than the initial setting of the trap. Nature did all the work herself. This method allowed water to be obtained in places where there were no rivers, lakes, or wells, for example, on hilltops or coastal cliffs. Today, similar but more technologically advanced fog catchers are used for water supply in the arid regions of Chile and Peru, but the principle itself was discovered centuries ago. And sometimes you didn't have to look up at the sky to find water. You just had to look under your feet and know which plants could point to it. The medieval peasant was also an excellent self-taught botanist. He did not know the Latin names, but he was able to identify hundreds of plants and their properties without error. And one of his most important practical skills was the ability to find water from indicator plants. He knew that certain types of grasses, flowers, and shrubs grow only where groundwater is close to the surface. When a peasant noticed thickets of such plants as reed, cattail, willow, or alder in a field or forest, he knew that this was the easiest place to dig a well or a hole to collect water. These plants were for him living pointers, green arrows on the map of nature, which unmistakably led to the hidden moisture. This knowledge was especially valuable when exploring new lands or during dry periods when new springs had to be found. Instead of digging randomly, wasting precious energy and time, man followed the green trail. It was an ingenious trick based on pure observation and centuries of experience. Moreover, some plants such as watercress or mint not only indicated the presence of water, but also its purity, as they prefer to grow near running, clean springs. Thus, botanical knowledge helped not only to find water, but also to assess its quality. Medieval herbalists and agricultural manuals sometimes mention such hydro-indicator plants. This knowledge was part of an oral tradition, passed down from father to son, and was key to the survival of the whole community. But what if there were no indicator plants, no river, not even fog, but only ice underfoot and cold? And in this case, the traveler had his own, though risky, cunning. In winter, far from fire, when any snow is dangerous to eat and there is nothing to melt it on, ice could be the last source of water. But how to turn it into a liquid without a fire? Medieval travelers, hunters, and warriors knew one desperate but effective method: to use their own body heat. They found pieces of pure ice, from the surface of a frozen stream or in the form of icicles. Ice, unlike snow, contains much less air and yields more water when it melts. These pieces of ice were put into a leather flask or a burden. Then this flask was hidden under the clothes as close to the body as possible, under the armpit, on the chest or stomach. The warmth of the human body was slowly but surely melting the ice. In a few hours, a small amount of cold but drinkable water appeared in the flask. This method was extremely energy-consuming for the body. The body was losing precious heat while warming the ice. It was a risky compromise to quench thirst but also to increase the risk of hypothermia. Therefore, this method was resorted to only in extreme cases, when there were no other options, and when the person was in motion, generating additional heat. It would be suicide to sit still and warm a flask of ice with one's body. But for a warrior on the march or a hunter stalking a beast, it might be the only chance not to die of dehydration. This stratagem demonstrates the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. It shows that even the riskiest methods were used in the fight for life. This knowledge of how dangerous it was to eat snow, but how ice could be used was part of the harsh science of survival, where the cost of error was incredibly high. But all these individual tricks would have been less effective without the most important medieval resource of all. At the center of any medieval English village was a well. It was not just a source of water, but the heart of the community, its social and even spiritual center. And it was treated in a special way. It was not just an engineering object, but a well heirloom, on the cleanliness and safety of which depended the life of all the inhabitants. The construction and maintenance of the common well was a village-wide endeavor. Men dug the shaft, reinforced it with stone or wood. Women and children helped to remove the earth. It was an act of collective labor that united people. Everyone felt responsible for the common source of life. The water from the well was considered not only clean, but also somewhat sacred. Community festivals, fortune-telling, and rituals were often held near wells. It was believed that water from one's well had healing powers and protected from illnesses and evil eye. Polluting or desecrating a well was considered a terrible sin and a crime. During wars, the first thing enemies did was to poison the wells to break the spirit of the defenders. The ingenious trick of this method was social control. Since all the inhabitants used the same well, everyone was interested in its cleanliness. The well was monitored by headmen, and order was maintained around it. It was a primitive but effective way of collective sanitation. The well was also the main place for exchanging news and gossip. Women who came to fetch water shared the latest events, discussed business, and solved disputes. It was a kind of village information center. Public opinion was born here, and neighborly ties were strengthened. Thus, the village well was much more than just a water pit. It was the embodiment of the community spirit, a symbol of unity and interdependence. And it was this social organization, this collective knowledge and responsibility, that was the main and most ingenious stratagem that allowed medieval Englishmen to survive and prosper. Looking at these ancient, almost forgotten methods of water extraction, we realize how resourceful and unbreakable was the spirit of medieval man. In conditions where every sip was worth its weight in gold, it was ingenuity, patience, and a deep knowledge of nature that allowed them to survive and move on. These stories are not just lessons in survival, but a reminder of how important it is to appreciate what we have and to remain hopeful even in the most challenging circumstances. If you are interested in such dives into the past, where reality and survival are intertwined with human fortitude, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Here you will find even more stories that will unlock the mysteries of the Middle Ages and help you understand how our ancestors lived and fought. Don't miss the new videos. History lives in the details, and we invite you to discover it with us.